something a little different this evening. Rob Stark of HBO Game of Thrones fame is going to take over the show, and he's going to interview me about Stormy Daniels, who I knew between 2003 and 2007 when I was blogging about the porn industry. I interviewed her several times, and our paths ran in similar circles for about 4 years. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Rob Stark. Go ahead, Rob.
Hi, Luke. Great speaking with you. Thanks for having me on. And this is a simulcast.
Yes.
So to start things off, we're going to be talking about the Stormy Daniels and the whole hush money trial with Trump. And you actually interviewed Stormy Daniels, but I think just to kind of give our audience kind of a reintroduction, if you can give a brief kind of background information of basically being the number one porn journalist and how that went and how you got out of that, just kind of a brief summary.
Yeah, so in the fall of 1995, I figured I needed to write a book. And so I went to the library and I went to various bookstores and I looked up different topics. And the one topic that had not been done for a couple of decades that I was interested in doing was a history of sex in film. So I started research on that in the fall of 1995. And then in the course of researching that topic, I developed a blog that was primarily about the porn industry. And I interviewed hundreds of people in the industry, and I wasn't able to put most of their stories into my book. So instead, I just transferred the interviews to my blog. And then I started updating it every day with the latest news going on in the sex industry. So I made my living primarily from blogging from about fall of 1997 until October of 2007, when I quit writing on the porn industry.
And can you give our audience the context of meeting Stormy Daniels? Did you meet her? I guess we'll start over. So can you give the context of how you met Stormy Daniels for the interview? This was at a Seymour Butts Showtime party in 2003.
Oh, okay. So I've forgotten that exact context, but we just ran in the same circles. So she was a prominent figure in the industry. She was among the most intelligent people in the industry, certainly among the performers. And she always had a sense of presence. So people are commenting now about her presence, her stage manner, her ability to think on her feet, stand up to cross-examination. Well, she was like that when I met her when she was 2003, so she would have been about 21 or 22 years of age. So as long as I've known her, she has had intelligence, she's had presence, she's had command of her words. She has never had a reputation for lying. She hasn't had a reputation for exaggeration, but she's been among the most level-headed members of the industry. And I've never seen her rattled. Now, of course, she's human, and I'm sure she gets rattled. But even back in 2003, she was careful in what she had to say, and she was, wary of my reputation. But she felt, very much in control of herself, and she knew the power that her presence had over men in particular.
How well did you know her?
I'd never personally just spent time with her hanging out. It was always in a professional sense. So I'd run into her at events. And so she knew that I had a prominent website in the industry. I knew that she was a prominent player in the industry. And so she treated me warily, but with respect. And I treated her warily, but with respect, because she had a formidable presence. You know how there are certain people who just, they just seem to invite you to abuse them. All right. There are certain people certain women who have the look, you can do anything you want to me, or certain guys who are just looking to be taken advantage of. She was the opposite of that. There are other people who you're always on your toes around because they're not going to put up with any nonsense. And sex workers often develop a pretty hard shell, and they learn how to take care of themselves. And they understand the difference between a manufactured image and what's real. And so they can turn it on or turn it off. But Stormy Daniels was always someone who gave off the the vibe that you better take it seriously and respectfully. Like there was nothing, absolutely nothing about her that invited you to treat her carelessly, invited you to treat her casually, invited you to treat her disrespectfully or to be abusive in any way. This was a woman who was very much seemed in charge of her trajectory. Now, I can look great in a suit. All right, there are situations where I can come across as commanding, and there are situations where I can come across as assured, and there are situations where I have presence. And so too with Stormy Daniels. Obviously, she's been married 4 times now. She's working as a stripper at age 45. All right, nobody would want this sort of life for someone they cared about, not for a niece or for a daughter or for a sister or for a mother. No one would want Stormy Daniels' life. And so even though I'm saying that she's got presence and that she's highly intelligent and that she can think on her feet and that she doesn't take crap from people, that doesn't mean that outside of these specific situations where she's seen publicly, that doesn't mean there aren't large cracks in the mirror. So even when I look good in a suit for about 12 years, I drove, 15 years, I drove a serial killer van. It was like a 1982 Dodge B350. So on the one hand, when I would walk into a party or a social occasion, I may be dressed well and have presence and command. But then I would go back to this van, and I was living in essentially a hovel at the time. And so it's a little bit like the picture of Dorian Gray. So on the outside, Stormy Daniels comes across as cool, calm, and collected. That doesn't mean that she doesn't have more than her share of pathologies on the inside. She just doesn't bring them forward, usually in an interview or in a court situation.
Is the interview, is it just a written transcript, or is there a video? Do you still have a video or audio of the interview, and is that available online?
It's not available online. I've probably got some backup of various video interviews I did with Stormy, but I took down almost all the video interviews I did with porn stars. It was the stuff that was getting the overwhelming number of hits on my YouTube channels, and I just didn't want to leverage that anymore unless there was something special. So there's an interview there with a deaf porn star who comes from a Jewish background, or there are some individual exceptions. But I took down dozens upon dozens of the video interviews that I did with various porn stars, including Stormy Daniels. I could probably retrieve them at some point. But she didn't say anything earth-shattering. She was always careful in what she said to me because she recognized that I had a widely read blog and that people would check it out first or second thing to begin the day to see what was going on in the industry. And initially, when I started blogging, people were incredibly free with me. They would just speak off the cuff because normally there's nothing people love more than talking about themselves, but there's nothing that people hate more than seeing these words finally end up in print, whether it's literal print or the print of the internet. And so people learn very quickly. And so all those vulnerable, oversharing interviews that I got to do in the early days, they became much harder to get as people became more savvy and as my website developed a wider readership and people saw that there were consequences for their words. Now, Stormy Daniels seemed to always have a sense that there were consequences for a word. So even if she'd never met me, right, I had nothing to do with Stormy Daniels developing a sense that there were consequences for her words. But she preternaturally had this sense of calm when she was questioned. And so some people, I guess, react to the trauma of early childhood by being easily thrown. Stormy Daniels developed a tough shell, a hard shell, and an ability to take care of herself and to intimidate people who may want to treat her trivially just because she's a porn star.
You said, you said that even though she came across as very verbally poised and impressive, you also said that you identified with her as a broken person who struggled with issues with attachment. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I don't remember all the details of her horrible early childhood, but it was not anything that anyone would wish on anyone they cared about. And so too with me, there was tremendous amount of chaos in my early childhood with my mother dying, I was living in foster care and moving around between different people who were looking after me. And so out of that, I developed a tremendous insecurity. And then when I would find things as I moved through life that made me feel more secure, such as in eighth grade, I decided, oh, I want to be a journalist when I grew up. And so when I would develop my journalistic chops, that would help me feel more secure in the world. Or I started running marathons when I was age 12, and having that athletic ability made me feel more secure in the world. Or at another time, I took up massive workouts, so doing push-ups and pull-ups, and just being incredibly strong, able to work in the 100-degree Sacramento heat for 80, 90 hours a week, and just building up that kind of vitality, it made me feel more confident and strong. And so I think people like Stormy and me, who come from chaotic early childhoods, we're very quick to try to latch onto things that might make us feel more secure in the world. And so I think she recognized, like many sex workers, the tremendous power that she had over men. And so it's always very tempting to take the easy solution, particularly when you're dealing with a tremendous amount of anxiety and insecurity. So you try to narrow down your options in life to very few, because you can manage those. And so one way that I reacted to the chaos of my early childhood is that I'm not terribly flexible. Most interpersonal interactions have to largely occur on my terms. And I'm not someone who's just chill with hanging out and letting things take their natural course. After an hour or two, all right, I'm going to get antsy usually. And so by narrowing the seemingly unlimited possibilities in life down to just a few, so that I put a lot of effort into my live streams, or I put a lot of effort into my blog posts, or I put a lot of effort into my religion or to my 12-step recovery, I managed to narrow all the options in life just down to a few that I specialize in, that bring me some comfort. And it seems like Stormy Daniels has narrowed her efforts in life just essentially down to sex work and to her daughter. She's now on marriage number 4, and I think she loves horses, so maybe a hobby or two. And so it's understandable that people react to chaos and insecurity by trying to hold on to one thing that makes their life manageable. And so with Stormy Daniels, she must have discovered early on the tremendous sexual allure that she possessed, and the power that gave her over men. And she probably also reacted to the insecurity of her childhood by wanting to accumulate money. And so she saw the Donald Trump interaction as an opportunity to make money. She got paid off. And when you're this insecure and you're this eager to try to narrow down your options, all right, you're not going to make the wiser, more considered choices of someone who's more secure in their attachment level. So about 2/3 of the population tends to be secure in their attachment level, meaning that when people treat them well, that they're open to developing relations with people who treat them well. When people treat them badly, then they distance themselves from people who treat them badly. And if people show no interest in interacting with them, the secure person doesn't push it, while the insecure or the avoidant attachment personality has all sorts of discordant responses to life. So I notice with my more healthy peers that they are able to take more time to make decisions, that they're able to see a bigger picture than I tend to, that they're able to weigh more of the consequences of their choices. And there's not the sense of desperation that people who come from chaotic childhoods often bring to making choices. And so I think it seems fairly obvious that Stormy Daniels reacted to the chaos and to the abuse of her early childhood by determining that she would have money and that she would make herself safe, and she would wield her power over men to secure for herself safety and financial resources. Now, the problem with narrowing down all your choices to sex work is that it precludes you from much wiser choices. This is a woman who, with any sort of healthy upbringing, could have made much more success of her life. She could have made much better choices. No one sane would wish Stormy Daniels' life. Yeah, she's making some money off Donald Trump, but think about all the stalkers, the harassment, having to hire attorneys, the the often unwanted spotlight, having your life turned, upside down for public consumption. So people who aren't desperate, people who don't have this overwhelming anxiety that they just have to get rid of as quickly as possible by deciding on one particular course of action, would make better choices than I've made over the course of my life, or that Stormy Daniels has made. One thing that I learned from approximately 10 years in therapy was that there are always more choices than what I wanted to believe. There's something appealing and calming for people with my levels of anxiety and insecurity with imagining that there's only two choices, when frequently there are many, many more choices than what I was seeing. It's just that I was approaching the world in a way that was like very rash, very quick to make definitive judgments, frequently against my own best interests. And I see that same sort of pattern with Stormy.
And you said you reject the narrative that she's making up the allegations to defame Trump. So you basically believe from your experience meeting her that she's telling the truth.
Yeah, she never had a reputation for fabrication. She was always careful with her words. She didn't exaggerate when I would interview her. So often people try to build up, castles of imaginary achievement or imaginary connections or imaginary reasons why they're so special. And I never, ever saw that with Stormy. She was quite unusual in her level-headedness. And I haven't followed her story closely, hitting the news with Donald Trump, but to the extent that I have followed it, I've never sensed anything that she's said that seems discordant with the truth, that just jars me. So I read part of her memoir, and I read in particular her interaction with Donald Trump. All has the ring of truth. And when Trump's defense attorneys would try to shake her on the stand and try to cut her down and try to humiliate her, she stood her ground very effectively. And it's a lot easier to stand your ground if you're basically coming from a place of truth, right? As opposed to a castle of lies that you're trying to protect. So Stormy has always exuded the sense of self-assurance that comes from a person who's just telling the truth. That doesn't mean that she's perfect. That doesn't mean that she hasn't misunderstood something, misremembered something, or she's as prone to exaggeration as the next person. But I've never seen a pattern of exaggeration. I've never seen a pattern of dysfunctional lying. I've never seen prevarication as being among her choices. And I've never seen anything that she said about Donald Trump that does not ring true.
To be honest, I haven't been following the trials that extensively, but what do you have, what are your overall thoughts on the trials and the legal case against Trump?
Well, the legal case against Trump from all the legal experts that I've listened to is that it's completely unprecedented to bring something like this. So it does not seem like a strong case. But also everything I've read about Stormy Daniels' testimony was that she acquitted herself quite well. I mean, no one of any stature has written that she fell apart on the stand, that she withered under cross-examination. No one's been able to provide any substantial evidence that she's saying things that are not true about Donald Trump. So she seems to have far more credibility than her accusers, those who want to deny the essential truth of her story.
Are you overall pro-Trump politically?
Yeah, I would still like to see Donald Trump as the next president of the United States, but more soberly than in 2015 or 2016. I will admit he's not very good at running things, that he was not particularly effective as a president, that he hasn't demonstrated much executive capacity, that he is embarrassingly childish and puerile, and his antics are off-putting. His behavior after the 2020 election result was appalling, that he played a substantial role in creating the chaos that led to January 6th, that he plunged much of the country into chaos by denying the legitimacy of the voting results. So Donald Trump is a very flawed vessel, but I still like his foundational principles, which his basic foundational beliefs are that trade should be run according to the best interests of Americans, not according to free market principles, but on a very pragmatic nationalist direction. And he's concerned about immigration, that we've allowed in way too much immigration, both legal and illegal. And he doesn't want us to get into unnecessary wars overseas. And so those are three of the most important issues. And add four to the extent he's for law enforcement. And he's certainly more for law enforcement than any Democratic candidate for president. So those are my top four issues: law enforcement, protecting the border, not getting into unnecessary wars overseas, and developing a trade policy that is aligned with the best interests of Americans rather than aligned with certain theoretical principles in economics.
Before I wrap this up and you'll ask me some questions, is there anything else you'd like to add about either Stormy Daniels or Donald Trump or any other political topic that's on your mind?
Well, it's just funny that Stormy Daniels comes across more impressively, I think, with regard to Donald Trump than vice versa. And so that represents the wildness of life. All right, who's the boss? I forgot who said it. The situation's the boss. So you might be the lead singer in number one rock band, but if your van breaks down on the way to the concert, the person who can fix your van becomes the boss. All right, and in certain situations, people like Stormy Daniels will thrive. In certain situations, I will thrive. For example, I'm good at conducting interviews, but I don't have the charismatic temperature-setting abilities of, say, a Kevin Michael Grace, who just by force of his charisma can power a show. I'm more of an MC, or the person who asks questions or instigates things. So in some situations, I shine. In some situations, Stormy shines. In some situations, Donald Trump would be the best president of the United States. Other situations, I think Joe Biden would be a better president. But it's kind of amusing that Biden is probably the most similar to Donald Trump in personality of any other major American politician. I'll pass there.
I guess one more question is, you've been following the online dissident right for years. What do you think, what have been your thoughts on the direction of the online dissident right over, say, the past 4 years? What have been some of your key observations?
Well, it started rising to prominence in 2014 when the dissident right moved from a movement that's primarily about writing blog posts to making podcasts and videos. So then the average level of IQ among people who are interested in the dissident right, dropped about 15 points. That's an observation by Colin Liddell. It's a sharp observation when the movement moved from being something that was primarily the written word to the spoken word. Then it essentially self-destructed in early 2016 with Hailgate and other forms of dysfunction that people just can't stand to be in each other's presence. And then the death knell was Charlottesville, when this online movement, which was once known primarily as a bunch of merry pranksters, became known in the popular imagination as a bunch of Nazis. And so the movement essentially died in 2018, and I haven't paid that much attention to it since about 2018, 2019. And I remember in 2020 how disgusted I was by so many people in the dissident right who didn't take COVID seriously. It just increasingly, as we move from 2017 onward, the movement just seemed to be an ongoing slow motion or rapid motion disaster, and nothing's developed in the past 4 years that's changed my opinion on that.
Luke, thanks for the interview. And if you want to go ahead and ask me some questions about my recent projects.
Yeah, so I haven't spoken to you for, I think, a year or so. So what have you been working on?
I think the last time we did a show was about January 6th. So that was about 3 years ago. Primarily what I'm working on is I've mostly been really active on Substack. So if you want to, I don't know if you want to ask about a specific article or you want to ask more about the process of writing.
Tell me what's been the primary focus of your attention. I assume that you're not married and that you don't have children, and so therefore I assume your Substack and your other ventures are the primary outlet for your energies once you pass the survival mode.
Yeah, I've been really prolific, and I've been getting some positive attention on some traction on Un's review, and also some post on Revolver News. Like one of my latest ones is I wrote a critique of Curtis Yarvin and his case for, and look, with Curtis Yarvin, I know he wrote it to be provocative, but I did write like a critique about his case for Joe Biden as dictator. That was one of them. And let me just look it over.
Well,
But yeah,
just
that
tell
was one of my most recent ones.
Yeah, but give me the overall. How are you primarily spending your time? Is it Substack? Is it art? Is it writing fiction?
A little bit of each of those, but like right now, like I'd say like over the past like 2 years, 2 to 3 years, like I've been putting like pretty much all my energy into Substack, and it has been growing. Like it's been growing. Like it was slow at first, but I'm getting to the point now where it has been growing significantly. Like there is a lot of traction.
Okay, and so no more novels from you in the past 3 years.
No more. Let's see. No more novels. I wrote two fiction novels, like several in the 2010s. One in 2017. One in 2019. Let's see. No, in 2021. But right now, I'm not really working on any novels. I've thought about writing a nonfiction about politics, and I've also thought about writing a fiction, like a horror novel. But right now, I'm too focused on my articles to really go forth with that. But that's something I've considered.
And what's Matt working on these days? You guys collaborated on making some videos back in the day.
He has. So I recently interviewed. This is on Stark Truth Radio and on my Substack, Robert Stark, Substack.com. But I recently interviewed him about his new book, The Black Album, and he has a big movie project coming out. But I don't know. It hasn't been announced, so I don't really want to give details about that. But you'll find out about that pretty soon, sometime this summer. But I don't, since like it's still in the early production stages, like I don't really want to get into any details about that. But I will be work, but I will say I'll be acting or having a role with that.
And how much time have you put into creating podcasts?
A little. Let's see. I haven't, because I'm so focused on writing, I haven't been working as much on podcasts. But I guess I'm getting back to it a bit. So like I did a recent podcast with Matt about his new book called The Black Album, which is a collection of short stories. I was interviewed by Matt for his podcast, and then I'm going to be interviewed this weekend. So I've been doing podcasts a bit more than I was maybe say a year ago. But overall, I'd say my primary focus is writing.
And how was your conversation with Anatoly Karlin?
That went well. So well, let's see, that was in the fall, I think, but he's kind of gone down the same path with Richard Hanania, where he totally rejected like the dissident right and nationalism, and basically more in the direction, I think, like you're obviously critical of that, but he's sort of gone in the Richard Hanania direction, where he's more pro liberalism, pro globalism, neoliberalism. So that was an interesting interview.
And you've also stayed in touch with Constantin von Hoffmeister. So that acquaintanceship or friendship goes back many years, right?
Yeah, I met him in person in Germany about 5 years ago, and I've interviewed him many times. And I've interviewed him about his book Esoteric Trumpism, and Arctos has also been publishing some of my articles. And when he came to LA, I met up with him in LA. Let's see, I think that was about 2.5 months ago.
So a lot of refugees from the dissident right are popping up in your Substack interviews.
Yeah, like it's really interesting seeing the different directions that different people are going in. Like the kind of I've noticed like the since the dissident right kind of collapsed, like I've noticed the NRX type scene that revolves around like Yarvin and Dime Square, like and I guess recently like there's been the whole thing with Lomez getting doxxed and not really being negatively impacted by the doxing and thriving and getting the interview he did with Steve Bannon. But that's kind of like the whole scene around Yarvin that seems to be like kind of an offshoot that's growing. But I mean, when you talk about the dissident right, it's sort of like splintered into all these sub factions. But I think it's a healthier environment in some ways. Like there was a whole big disaster, and like the quality of there was a big decline in sort of like the quality of content. But then I think the positive now is like things are decentralized, so you have all these people kind of doing their own thing. And I think the creativity, like the online politics stuff, was a failure. But I like seeing people doing more stuff that's creative, like literature or even some of these like different various like online publishers. Like that's the creative stuff interesting me more. I'm kind of burnt out from politics.
What's going on with Matt Forney these days?
I have no idea. He published Matt's first book, Dragon Day, and I interviewed him a couple years ago, but I haven't heard from him in maybe like a year or two.
Okay. And what is esotericism?
Esotericism, let's see the definite. I don't know if I give him. It's about. It relates to things like mysticism and the occult, but I think it's interesting, like how we approach things like day to day life, culture, politics through a different lens. I think like the way I like to look at it is esotericism is really like consciousness. So how we experience like what creates reality, it's a combination of matter and consciousness. So like shifting, we're really like mysticism, what it really is it's a shift in consciousness.
So, is it a way to try to get the benefits of belonging to some transcendent organized religion, but without paying the price?
I wouldn't say like for me it's more just I just find it interesting, but I think for some people that's how it works for them. But for me, I just find it really interesting.
And what kind of shape do you think California is in? Do you think we're trending in a positive or a negative direction?
It's negative, but I think the right wing media, they tend to be overly sensational and they exaggerate stuff. But it's kind of like a gradual decline, but it is definitely a decline, but it's not as bad as a lot of the right wing media would say. But you living in LA, like you would probably agree with that.
Yeah, I'm quite happy in LA. I mean, there are problems, but it's still a beautiful place to live. And
Right, exactly.
I mean, you still love living in California with all its problems.
Yeah, even with the problems, like I have no plans to leave.
What keeps you here, aside from like personal stuff? But what is it
Personal
about
stuff,
California?
let's see, personal stuff, just that I've lived here all my life. I don't really have the strong enough connections to anywhere else. The weather, the geography. I like travel. I mean, I like traveling within California. A lot of different reasons, like especially the personal connections.
So, what's YIMBY? Is that yes in my backyard?
Yeah, the people who want to build more housing, and like I used to be sort of loosely, if like more sympathetic to that, but like in principle, I agree. But they've gone in a pretty like more like left wing direction. I mean, there's negative thing. I think I'm sympathetic to like the concept, but there are a lot of things I really dislike about the movement.
So, how many people would you like to see living in California? I would be happy with 20 million or 30 million. So, we're currently under 40 million, and I have no desire for our population to grow in California. What about you?
No, I don't really think it should grow dramatically. I guess with housing, it's more the issue is like, do you build? I guess the question is, do you build for people who are already here? But then, like by building more, are you just attracting more people? And if you're not allowed, unless you're allowed like anything like discriminatory, that's just how things are gonna work. Like you build, can you build for people already here to address the housing needs, or or by building, do you just attract more people and you create this endless cycle? So I guess that's kind of the debate.
Well, do you have a perspective on how to mitigate our homeless problem?
I think I think providing housing, but also make it pretty strict. So if housing is available, then people just can't like camp out in the streets. So if housing is available, then it's going to have to be mandatory for people to go into that housing. Like can't just tolerate the status quo. Like that can't really be tolerated. I mean, a lot of, and I don't know, like with housing, like the problem is I'm supportive of that, but there's all this like grift and like the homeless industrial complex. So I heard a story about like building $1 million condos in Santa Monica for the homeless. Like there's just so much corruption.
So, what about California's crime problem? What do you see as solutions to that?
Just I don't really think anything radical, but just reverse. So like just I mean, even if we just went back to like what we were doing before 2020, I don't even think like like really radical crackdown is necessary. Just taking care of like the basics. Because even San Francisco, even like there was this big, because I saw the stats, like there was a big spike in crime right around 2020 for obvious reasons, but actually crime is starting to go down again. So even if we just went back to like what we were doing in 2019, I think things would be relatively like sane.
Wait, what are the obvious reasons that crime went up in 2020?
Just but like the refusal to just address just basic the refusal to address crime, because there was a whole kind of a reaction against like George Floyd in some of these cities like LA and San Francisco. Local politicians were pushing the police not really to become like much less engaged with like, well, petty crime, but even like violent crime.
So, what are the political issues in California that you think about the most?
I haven't really been focusing on. I think the big one is like is housing.
Okay, well, say more. I mean, you can't say I haven't been focusing. You write a lot about California, so
Oh, I have.
go ahead.
I think the big one is housing, but
But what does that mean? I mean, tell me more.
I guess like the supply is an issue, but also like rebuilding. I'm really interested in like rebuilding cities and more in the like the aesthetic attributes and making more like walkable cities. That's a huge issue, which I think overlaps with the housing supply, but it's also kind of sort of a separate issue, but making more like walkable communities is something that I'd like to see more of.
Now, you ride public transportation, and there's a tremendous crime problem on public transport in Los Angeles. What do you see as a solution to that problem?
I haven't ridden public transportation in LA in a long time, but I do remember I took one time like I took the subway from, this was in the like in I think this was like in 2012 maybe, or around 2010. I took the subway from downtown LA to Hollywood, and I got my wallet stolen in the subway. And then I, for some reason, like I saw Richard Lewis walking down the Sunset Strip that same day.
Okay, and you do ride public transport, whether it's in LA or not. Uh, what are your thoughts on how to improve the quality of public transport in California?
I support like expanding public transport, and I support like expanding the subway in LA. But the issue is like safety, like just taking care of basic safety. I don't probably that's something that's a problem, but also the corruption with the cost of like high speed rail. I initially supported that, and I think I voted for the bond measure behind that. But that it's really been like I support it in principle, but there's just so much corruption, and that, I mean, that corruption is a huge problem. But that, I mean, that applies to building like subway lines too. But I'm generally like I think I heard in LA like there is this new subway line from downtown to Beverly Hills down Wilshire is supposed. I think it's supposed to open either this year or next year.
Okay. And what about declining social trust and declining social cohesion in the United States? Any thoughts on how to turn that around?
That's a huge problem, but I don't think it can be fixed. Like some people want like national service. Like I don't think it can be solved on a national issue. I think something it's going to be like people are atomized, but I think it's going to be more like the solution is people forming like more tribes or more kind of building communities based on some kind of shared value or identity. But I just I don't I think people who talk about like restoring social trust on a national level, like they're stuck way back like in the 20th century. Like that's not going to happen. It's going to be something more like on a tribal level where people build community and social trust based on a shared identity.
Right. Well, I'd say if you can put super predators away in prison for a long time, you will start to improve social cohesion and social trust. It just takes, one bad apple in a group of 10,000 people to destroy social cohesion and social trust. On the other hand, we know that if we put people who commit violent crime away for a very long time, they are not out in the streets creating more violent crime. So if we simply crack down on the super predators, crack down on the people who are committing violent crime, we can substantially reduce our problem with violent crime, and then people will naturally expand their lives. But as long as crime and homelessness and this kind of dysfunction is at the levels it is now, people will lead small lives, all right? People will stay within their own home, their own workplace, and within their own particular community where they feel safe, because the outside world in America's big cities is incredibly chaotic. But you can just take the 100 most disruptive people on Los Angeles public transport and put them behind bars or put them in a mental health institute, and you would dramatically improve the quality of life on public transportation in Los Angeles. You have to target the people who are most disruptive of the public square, and you have to either put them away in prison or put them away in a mental asylum, but they have to be removed from polite company, because it just takes a tiny number of people to disrupt our public spaces. So if we focus on the most disruptive, the most dangerous people who are disrupting our public spaces and either get them in prison or get them in a mental institution, then we can start to begin public life.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, basically agree.
Okay, any final words, anything that you want to, wait, what's your perspective on Curtis Yarvin? Like, where do you see his importance? What's his contribution?
I actually have criticisms of him. Like he seems to kind of worship power for the sake of power. I think the right thing is having the right people of the highest caliber, but obviously I want people who I agree with to be in positions of power. He just seems to support like worship power for the sake of power, which obviously like he said he posts article kind of like for clickbait, like he says he wants Joe Biden to be dictator to be provocative, and I don't have a problem with that. But my critique of Yarvin is he seems to worship just power for the sake of power. Like he wants to give those currently in power actually more power rather than replacing them with better people. So I've actually been critical of Yarvin.
Okay, and how would you describe your worldview?
Wow, that's a lot of. I mean that could be like a whole hour, but I'm for kind of like I don't know if you want to call it like proportional inequality. So you have like communism. Communism failed because it's kind of like an attempt of like the rule of the proletariat, a dictatorship of the proletariat, and that failed. Capitalism's rule of like the merchant class, and then fascism was an attempt of rule of the warrior caste. So I see like different like kind of, if you want to call it castes, like the warriors, the merchants, the artists, spiritualists, like different groups, probably like sharing power and balance is what I'd like to see.
Okay, Robert, any final words?
That's all. But I would like to ask everyone, like, please subscribe to my Substack. It's robertstark.substack.com. And thank you, Luke. It's been a great show. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thanks, Robert. Good to catch up with you. It's been too long. Thanks, man.
Thanks. Take care.
Take care. Okay. I just read an important article in The Atlantic. Against sunscreen absolutism. Moderate sun exposure can be good for you. Why won't American experts acknowledge that? Well, the amount of sun exposure that's good for you is going to vary on the person. So people from Northern Europe are going to be the most vulnerable to sunburn, and people from more temperate climes and towards the equator, right? People whose ancestors come from nearer to the equator, they are much less vulnerable to sunshine. And you can extrapolate out from this into all sorts of areas of life. Different situations, right, are differently suited to different people, right? Not everyone is suited to work with a computer all day, right? Some people are much better suited to working with their hands. Work from home, right? People who are making over $50 an hour, they were unaffected by work from home restrictions. Their income didn't go down, but people who are earning under $30 an hour, their income was devastated. So same situation, but completely different results depending upon your skill set and what you're doing for a living. And so in Australia, where I come from, the Aborigines are particularly skilled at tracking, at existing in the desert environment where Europeans would very quickly die, right? The Aborigines were more adept at finding water and finding food and just surviving in incredibly harsh terrain. On the other hand, some people are particularly adept at surviving in a law office or a big city hospital or the life of the academic. So different people have different gifts, right? The sun falls on the just and the unjust, but the amount of sun that's good for you is going to depend upon where your ancestors come from. Right, this is from The Atlantic. Oh, subscribe to listen to this article? You've got to be kidding me. I don't have to subscribe to listen to this article. I probably should have checked that before I began the stream. It's Stephen Walt.
In the next 10 years, got a two-state solution, a genuine two-state solution. That'd be a good thing. But it actually would not affect the lives of most Americans at all. Wouldn't make us safer, wouldn't make us more prosperous. It'd be a good thing, right? If you got a one-state solution, right, that wouldn't affect the lives of most Americans one way or the other as well. In fact, what happens in that particular conflict is not going to affect the lives of most Americans at all, right? When you think of what's happening in Sudan today or what's been happening in Ukraine, that doesn't have a direct effect on most Americans as well. So what happens between the 7.5 million Israeli Jews and the 7.5 million Palestinian Arabs ultimately is not going to affect the lives of most Americans very much. A small number of Americans care very deeply about this, that I get, but the rest of America will be just fine regardless of what happens. And I would say the same thing about Jordan. I'd say the same thing about Iraq. Look at all that Iraq has been through since the United States invaded in 2003, and ultimately the lives of most Americans, we've just gone on. We've put that in the memory hole, although we did spend several $1 trillion doing it, which we could have done more useful things with. Again, what I'm suggesting is these things actually don't matter all that much to us as well. And I agree again with Aaron that our ability to shape the local politics of this region is quite limited. So what should we be doing? Well, we should have, instead of having, one final thing. If what happens between Israel and Palestine doesn't matter that much to Americans, then there is a puzzling question. Why did the U.S. Congress just send another, $24 billion? $26 billion to one of those parties as if it really mattered to Americans when it really doesn't. It doesn't affect their security, it doesn't affect their prosperity, and it's not doing very much for our image on the world stage. Now, What should we be doing? Well, we should be having normal relationships with everyone in the Middle East. Instead of special relationships with some countries in the Middle East, Israel, to some extent Egypt, and perhaps eventually to Saudi Arabia, and no relationship whatsoever with other countries in the region, such as Iran. I'll give you an example of a country that has a slightly different approach to this problem, China. China has relations with everyone in the Middle East. They talk to everyone. They trade with everyone, right? They don't have special relations with some countries and no relationships with others. And among other things, over time, this starts to give China more influence and leverage. So if I have a fantasy, and Aaron can tell me why this fantasy is.
Okay, so even if there was peace between the Israelis and the Arabs, or if there was just the kind of bloody mess that you have right now, it doesn't make any difference to the lives of average Americans. And so the American government should focus on the well-being of American citizens, not the citizens of foreign nations. All right, The Atlantic against sunscreen absolutism. Come on, play the bloody thing, right? Yes. Wait. Come on.
Acknowledge that.
I'll slow down.
Written by Rowan Jacobson for The Atlantic. Narrated by Dan Bittner for Apple News Plus subscribers.
Okay, here we go.
Australia is a country of abundant sunshine, but the skin of most Australians is better adapted to gloomy England than the beaches of Brisbane. The country's predominantly white population has by far the world's highest rate of skin cancer, and for years, the public health establishment has warned residents about the dangers of ultraviolet light. A 1980s ad campaign advised Australians to slip, slop, slap. If you had to go out in the sun, slip on a shirt, slop on some sunscreen, and slap on a hat. The only safe amount of sun was none at all. Then in 2023, a consortium of Australian public health groups did something surprising. It issued new advice that takes careful account for the first time of the sun's positive contributions.
So one way that my family went against conventional health advice was that we all believed that a moderate amount of sunlight was good for you. And various members of my family were very much against using sunscreen. I do use sunscreen.
The advice itself may not seem revolutionary. Experts now say that people at the lowest risk of skin cancer should spend ample time outdoors. But the idea at its core marked a radical departure from decades of public health messaging.
So public health messaging faces a very difficult challenge, all right? They have to give messages that can be useful for people with 80 IQs and 120 IQs, or 140 IQs, or 95 IQs. And so it's a lot easier just to make some absolute statement, such as, reducing your exposure to sun.
Completely avoiding sun exposure is not optimal for health. Read the group's position statement, which extensively cites a growing body of research. Yes, UV rays cause skin cancer, but for some, too much shade can be just as harmful as too much sun. It's long been known that sun exposure triggers vitamin D production in the skin, and that low levels of vitamin D are associated with increased rates of stroke, heart attack, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, depression, osteoporosis, and
Right, so we all benefit from some sunlight, right? But some people, such as those whose ancestors come from Northern Europe, right, they need to minimize the amount of sunlight and have pretty strong blocks against sunlight, such as sunscreen with a very high number on it. Other people can do just fine without sunscreen unless they're out there for hours and hours and hours. So different people have different vulnerabilities and different gifts.
Other diseases. It was natural to assume that vitamin D was responsible for these outcomes. Imagine a treatment that could build bones, strengthen the immune.
Right, so we were told during COVID in particular that we needed to be taking vitamin D, but the body doesn't assimilate vitamin D very effectively in pill form, just like the body doesn't tend to assimilate vitamin B12 very effectively in pill form or in injections, right? The most effective way to assimilate vitamin B12, right, is to eat meat and to eat fish. And if you're a vegetarian, all right, you are very likely to have a problem with not metabolizing enough vitamin B12.
system and lower the risks of illnesses like diabetes, heart and kidney disease, high blood pressure, and cancer, the New York Times wrote in 2010. Some research suggests that such a wonder treatment already exists. It's vitamin D. By 2020, more than 1 in 6 adults were on that wonder treatment in the form of daily supplements, which promise to deliver the sun's benefits without its dangers. But sunlight in a pill has turned out to be a spectacular failure. In a large clinical trial that began in 2011, some 26,000 older adults were randomly assigned to receive either daily vitamin D.
So in a whole bunch of areas, we're better off, right, consuming our supplements, consuming our vitamins in the ways that our ancestors have for thousands upon thousands of years, such as eating meat.
Pills or placebos, and were then followed for an average of 5 years. The study's results were published in the New England Journal of Medicine 2 years ago. An accompanying editorial with the headline, "A Decisive Verdict on Vitamin D Supplementation," noted that no benefits whatsoever had been found for any of the health conditions that the study tracked. Vitamin D supplementation did not prevent cancer or cardiovascular disease, prevent falls, improve cognitive function, reduce atrial fibrillation, change body composition, reduce migraine frequency, improve stroke outcomes, decrease age-related macular degeneration, or reduce knee pain.
So depending on where your ancestors came from, all right, there are different levels of blood pressure that are healthy for you. You're going to be able to metabolize or not effectively metabolize different medication, right? Unless you are a doctor who racially profiles, right? You are an inept doctor. You need to racially profile your patients so you know what kind of test results and what kind of medication is best for them.
The journal said, people should stop taking vitamin D supplements to prevent major diseases or extend life. Australia's new guidance is in part a recognition of this reality. It's also the result of our improved understanding of the disparate mechanisms through which sunlight affects health. Some of them are intuitive. Bright morning light, filtered through the eyes, helps regulate our circadian rhythms, improving energy, mood, and sleep. But the systemic effects of UV light operate through entirely different pathways that have been less well understood by the public, and even many health professionals. In recent years, that science has received more attention, strengthening conviction in sunlight's possibly irreplaceable benefits. In 2019, an international collection of researchers issued a call to arms with the headline, "Insufficient sun exposure has become a real public health problem."
So for almost everyone, they need to get at least 10 minutes of sun a day. And other people are better off with 30 minutes of sun a day. Other people are better off with 2 hours of sun a day. Once again, it largely depends upon where your ancestors came from and the relation of your ancestors to the equator. Different people have different vulnerabilities and different gifts.
Health authorities in some countries have begun to follow Australia's lead, or at least to explore doing so. In the United Kingdom, for example, the National Health Service is reviewing the evidence on sun exposure with a report due this summer. Dermatology conferences in Europe have begun to schedule sessions on the benefits of sun exposure after not engaging with the topic for years. In the United States, however, there is no sign of any such reconsideration. Both the CDC and the American Academy of Dermatology still counsel strict avoidance.
So the United States is about the most diverse of first world nations, and that makes public health messaging even more difficult. And it makes it even more difficult on things like how much sunshine should you get, because different groups in the United States need vastly different amounts of sunshine and need vastly different amounts of sunscreen protection.
Recommending that everyone but infants wear sunscreen every day, regardless of the weather. When I asked the AAD about Australia's new guidelines, a spokesperson offered only that because ultraviolet rays from the sun can cause skin cancer, the Academy does not recommend getting vitamin D from sun exposure.
So for many experts, all right, they are going to err on the side of caution, right? That's how they're going to talk about it. But they're not being cautious with regard to people's best interests, and everyone needs some sunshine. But if you specialize in a particular thing, like skin cancer, all right, if you are using a hammer all day, all right, you're going to look at all problems as something that needs a hammer, or something that needs to reduce skin cancer. But good values always exist in a constellation, right? On the one hand, there's the good value of reducing your exposure to the type of sunshine that can bring skin cancer. But on the other hand, everybody needs some sunshine, right? Truth is a great value, but there are other times when there are more important values than truth. And so young people in particular seize absurdly on a handful of values and pursue them to absurd lengths. Wiser people understand that goodness, righteousness, justice operates in a constellation.
Such a stance surely reflects understandable concerns about mixed messaging, but it also seems more and more outdated and suggests a broader problem with American public health institutions.
So mixed messaging is a polite term, but when you have different groups that need very different messages, but that's the reality, right? Different groups need different messages with regard to public health and with regard to many other things, right? Some groups need more law enforcement attention than other groups.
More than a century ago, scientists began to notice a mysterious pattern across the globe, which they came to call the latitude effect. Once you adjust for confounding variables such as income, exercise, and smoking rates, people living at high latitudes suffer from higher rates of many diseases than people living at low or middle latitudes. The pattern plays out in many conditions, but it's most pronounced in autoimmune disorders, especially multiple sclerosis. Throughout Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, populations at higher latitudes are much more likely to develop MS than those closer to the equator. Over the years, scientists have offered many theories to explain this phenomenon. Differences in diet, something in the water. But MS research pointed to a perhaps more obvious answer: sunlight. The higher the latitude, the lower the angle of the sun, and the more its rays are filtered by the atmosphere. A number of studies have found links between sun exposure and the disease. Kids who spend less than 30 minutes a day outside on weekends and holidays are much more likely to develop MS than kids who are outside for more than 1 hour on these same days. Relapse rates for the disease are higher in early spring, after months of sun scarcity. People who were born in the spring, whose mothers received little sun exposure during their third trimester of pregnancy, are more likely to develop MS than people born in the fall. Here too, scientists first assumed that vitamin D was the key. But vitamin D supplementation proved useless for MS. Could something else about sun exposure protect against the condition? A hint came from another disease, psoriasis, a disorder in which the immune system mistakes the patient's own skin cells for pathogens and attacks them, producing inflammation and red, scaly skin. Since ancient times, it had been...
Okay, so the more a nation has in common, all right, the easier it is to give public health messaging, the easier it is to tell the truth, right, the more social cohesion and social trust you're going to have. And if you want to build a better California, build a better nation, right, you want to incentivize good behavior and punish those who engage in antisocial behavior. And in California, we've undertaken this vast experiment of dramatically reducing criminal penalties. And so we've had an explosion of criminal behavior. Stephen Pinker's got an important tweet here: resident physicians' exam scores, but not subjective ratings of their knowledge and skills, tied to patient survival, right? Consistent with 70 years of research in psychology shows that objective measures outpredict expert judgment. So in all sorts of areas of life, you want the smartest, most capable people, and affirmative action works against this. Focus on disparate outcomes and how we need to, change scoring systems work against this. Right? Instead, we need to get back to a society that values excellence and that values the things that we have in common and devalues things that are destructive, such as diversity. Diversity means that we don't have much in common. Right? Why would we celebrate not having much in common? That's crazy. Right. Talk to you.